Hi, I'm Jason Cato, Managing Editor here at the Post and Courier. Welcome to everyone joining us for this Beyond the Headlines virtual event. I'm joined by David Slade, a veteran reporter who, among many coverage areas at the paper, is focused on growth and development in the Charleston region, as well as around South Carolina. And Briah Lumpkins, an investigative fellow with the Post and Courier's Watchdog and Public Service team. Welcome to you both. First, I'd like to remind everyone that the event is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent after the event with contact information in case viewers have more questions. We encourage anyone with a question they would like to be considered to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. But we're here today to discuss a new series, the Post and Courier, called Priced Out, which is an ongoing examination of soaring rents, both in and around Charleston, as well as across the state. The project so far has published 4 installments, beginning with the first in October. David, we've done lots of reporting about the housing affordability crisis. What prompted the Priced Out series?
Thanks, Jason. So as you said, we've been writing a lot about affordable housing in the Charleston area, particularly for some time, and challenges in homeownership in particular. But as the just unprecedented rent increases seen in 2021 and 22 became apparent, we knew that must be having just a tremendous impact on local residents, and we decided to dive into the issue. And we quickly found that renters are just being stretched to the limit, often forced to relocate or even leave the area, and employers were becoming increasingly concerned. And we're giving our readers, a clear picture here of the challenges that people are facing, but also exploring the potential solutions. And that's kind of where we started from.
We've seen prices rising for all sorts of things, due to inflation. And is that why rents are going up so fast?
That's a great question. I hear that a lot. The interesting thing is the way they calculate inflation, is based on the consumer price index, and rent is part of that. So rents are sort of going up along with inflation, but rents also are inflation. Rising rents are actually one of the things driving inflation. And they're at the same time sort of in response to it. It's an interesting puzzle, but what the one Federal Reserve study that I read suggested was a little interesting, and they basically blamed roughly half the increase in rents and also in housing prices on the shift toward working from home and remote workers. They basically said that accounts for about half of it.
And how is that?
Well, I don't honestly have all the details of that study fresh in my mind, but we all do know that with all the working from home, people frankly need more space than a lot of people had available, unless they want to sit on their bed with a laptop.
Okay, got you. I remember when I rented my first apartment as a College of Charleston student in the early 1990s, date myself here. I remember we paid it was around $700, maybe $710 for a 2-bedroom apartment on Bennett Street, which is right across from the columns of the old museum in Cannon Park. And then having recently moved back last summer, I now pay triple that, for a townhouse, that's out further beyond 526 in West Ashley. So quite staggering of how things have changed, around this area. But Briah, you recently moved to the Charleston area as well. What was it like for you to find housing?
Yeah, so I moved to the Charleston area in June when I first started. And when I was first looking for housing, it became clear very quick that living downtown on the peninsula wasn't an affordable option for me. Even though it was close to work and close to some of the things that I enjoy, it just wasn't realistic. So I'm currently in Ladson, and I lived in Ladson, Goose Creek, Somerville, and I enjoy the apartment that I'm at. I think it's a nice place, has some of the amenities that I like. But I recently looked at some rents in other places nearby just to see what it looks like now that I've been here for some time. And if I were to move today to another apartment, I'd be paying the same or maybe even a little bit more for an apartment that's the same quality as the one that I'm living in now. So I wouldn't say that it was a difficult decision to make to find a place, but I quickly realized that my options weren't as plentiful as I thought they would be once I got here.
Yeah, and Jason, if I could jump in for a sec.
Absolutely.
It might also kind of help frame this conversation if we just hit real quick on what sort of thing we're talking about when we talk about soaring rent. I mean, we're talking about people who have seen their rent go up 35, 40, 50% in just 2 years. We're some of the people we've interviewed for this series. One guy I talked to is a bartender in Mount Pleasant. He's renting an efficiency apartment for almost $1,700 a month. These rents are just sky high, and the way they've increased over just the past 2 years has just been staggering.
And clearly wages haven't gone up with that cost. So that's where the crunch and where it becomes real for people very quickly. That you go from having one lease to another, and if that's the increase, it's how much can you afford to do that, and how are you going to afford to do that? I think that's the biggest concern and pressure. Briah, you jumped in to contribute to the Priced Out project with an article last month exploring what's happening to 30-somethings in Charleston, or many 30-somethings in Charleston. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the premise of that story was?
Yeah, so I just spoke to some people who are in their 30s who've either experienced a rent increase or have been in a position where they felt like they couldn't live on their own, and who would like to, being in their 30s. And I spoke to some housing experts on that situation, and also just getting people's perspectives on their current situation, and some of their frustrations and concerns about it. So I created a survey when I was initially trying to find sources, just asking people where they lived, how much were they paying for rent, how many roommates did they have, and just the circumstances of their situation. And I got some a healthy amount of responses from people on social media to that survey, and varying responses too. There are people who have lived with roommates forever because they felt like they couldn't afford not to, have lived on and off with roommates, etc. But that's kind of what the focus of the story was.
And a lot of that was that many of them were living with or having to find roommates for long after they thought they would have to, or certainly ever hoped or imagined to. And you mentioned a survey and using online. Is that mainly how you found people to talk to about their situations?
That, and I also just spoke to some people in our newsroom and saw who they knew, and friends of friends of friends, and experiences that they had as well. So just talking to other people was also a good way to find sources.
And who was was there one most compelling renter person you interviewed for your story that stuck out to you?
Yeah, you mentioned people who had to find roommates way after than they were expecting to. And I started off this story talking to a woman named Maggie. She was 38 years old, has lived alone most of her adult life, was living in her dream apartment in James Island, had a good job, and she was at a point in her life where she felt a level of security. She wasn't expecting anything to change drastically in regard to her living arrangement. And one day she got a notice that her rent was about to increase 19%, which was a complete shock to her. And she had gone through some personal challenges that have caused her to divvy up her finances accordingly. And when it came down to it, she found out that paying that extra 19% a month just wasn't going to be realistic for her. She looked at some other places. She really wanted to stay near the area she was, and just found out that nothing that she could find was in her price range. So I just think what really stuck out is just how frustrated and disappointed she was about the situation and what had happened. And I talked with her and all of my other sources about just kind of like the societal expectations of it all. And I think once you're in your 30s, there's an expectation that you should be able to afford to live on your own or to buy a house and support, husband, wife, kids, etc. But what I found to be really interesting is that Maggie included, but the other sources that I spoke to weren't embarrassed or ashamed of this situation. Then they were more just angry and frustrated about it. Because from their perspective, they've gone to school, have a job, and felt like they were following the trajectory that would lead them to having that and being able to live alone. But surging rents just still made that unattainable. So just a lot of frustration and anger and a want to find a solution. What is going to make this situation better? So that's what really stood out. And I think Maggie's experience really highlighted that.
You really can't understate or overstate the anger and frustration you're seeing from people. I mean, some stories, it's hard to find sources. This has not been one of them. I mean, you go on, social media sites, Facebook, Nextdoor, whatever, and ask people about their rent experiences. People are furious. I mean, we've heard from families that have had to move their kids to different school districts because they suddenly can't afford the house they've been living in. I talked to one guy whose rent went up 40% a single year, and he said, I'm done with Charleston. He moved to Columbia and bought a house. Yeah, people are just absolutely furious, and they don't really seem to have an option because, I mean, before we were writing all about rent, we were writing about the price of housing in this area, which has gone through the roof. And now that interest rates have more than doubled, I mean, payments are just unaffordable for lots of first-time buyers, even if they could find a house to buy. And of course, that's pushed more people back into renting, which supports the huge rent increases. So people feel trapped, they feel angry, they feel frustrated.
So do you think that, I mean, we mentioned some of inflation, and of course, it's had an impact on everything. Supply and demand, as you're mentioning now, the rising interest rates for home buyers, and then thus keeping more people in a rental market that I mean, I see it out there just about everywhere you drive in this region. There's units being built and things going up, but it's almost like they can't build them fast enough, and they will fill them as soon as they can, and there will still be a demand for more. All of this has to at some point have an impact on that. Are there other, and I'm looking at some of the questions here, just, one person just wants to know, where does greed perhaps factor into some of this? I don't know that we can answer that directly, but I think that there's a lot of, when you see prices increasing at the percentage rates that we're talking about, there have to be a variety of factors that are playing into that.
Well, I'll take a brief shot at the greed question. And I mean, whether greed's the right word or not, we increasingly have tremendous numbers of apartments, especially the big apartment complexes owned by investment firms and hedge funds. I mean, some of them own 100,000 apartments. And they do a lot of their pricing using, artificial intelligence driven pricing programs. And yes, their goal is to get as much rent as they possibly can. Some people would call that greed. Some people would call that, serving your shareholders. But yeah, I mean, the goal, at least for the large apartment owners, is to extract as much rent as they possibly can.
Yeah, and much of that isn't local, and they spread out around the country looking for high growth areas and desirable places where people want to be, and try to find a way of justifying paying more and or charging more. Brian, back to your story in the 30-something. One more question on that. What was the response? What did you hear back after it published in early December?
Yeah, so a lot of the response I saw was on social media, and just kind of going back to my own personal experience, I think it really just affirmed that. There were people raising their hands and saying, like, I live in Latson, at Somerville, Goose Creek, or even further out, and I'm struggling to pay for my one bedroom apartment, or I have to take on a roommate because I can't afford to live by myself. So very, very similar situations to what I experienced. But I think when I was reporting this story, so most of the people I spoke to either live downtown on the peninsula or pretty nearby. And a lot of the solutions in their minds were to move further out, and to maybe that rent would be more affordable out there. And I think it just shows that it's bigger than what's just happening downtown. It's happening all across the metro area, that people are facing this problem. So that was a lot of the response that I got.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not a Charleston Peninsula issue. This is, well, it's partly a national issue, but particularly in high growth areas. I mean, we're seeing similar things throughout the Charleston metro area, but also in Myrtle Beach, in Beaufort, in Greenville, in Rock Hill. There are always supply demand questions people raise, and that's particularly relevant here because South Carolina picks up about another 60 to 65,000 residents every year. And they're not spread out all over the state. They're all coming to these popular cities. At the same time, like you said, Jason, I mean, we're seeing construction cranes, fill the sky every day. And but the rents don't seem to go down. If there's any little glimmer of good news, most of the latest reports are that at least rent increases seem to have sort of fallen off at the end of this year. That doesn't mean rents are going down, though.
Yeah, and some of were submitted in questions before the event for people who signed up for it, and some of the chatter in there now, that the impact isn't just on 30-somethings and younger people. I mean, we have seniors, a healthy number of seniors who rent, and families, people with children, and who are, the impacts of that, from moving to place and changing schools. And, it's more than just about where you live. It's also about where you work, where you go to school, the communities that you're part of, and maybe that no longer part of. Is that part of all of, the priced out series, is kind of a spin-off, a more focused version of some of the stuff we've looked at in Boom and Balance. But these are issues that have been facing the state, I'd say, for quite some time. Is that not correct? And being exacerbated now by these sharp increases in the last, 2+ years.
Oh yeah, I mean that's absolutely fair. I mean you could go back, 10 or 15 years, and you would see that lots of the more moderately paid workers in our area are living in places like Goose Creek and Latson and commuting. I mean, the affordability crisis is also a large part of our traffic problem here, for that reason. But what's really different now, and again, what sort of prompted this series, people aren't used to seeing their rent go up 20, 30, 40% in a single year. And that's been happening. I mean, the average isn't quite that high, but I mean, one of the reports I looked at, I think it was the Zillow Observed Price Index, had rents in Mount Pleasant going up 47% in the past 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mean that puts it in the top 50 cities in the nation for how much the rent increased, and Charleston and North Charleston and Myrtle Beach aren't far behind.
And David, you already touched on this a little bit about what's happening in the Charleston region and how that compares to what's happening in some other parts of South Carolina. But those monstrous percentage increases, are being seen, all across the state, and as you noted, all across the country as well. And you mentioned one of the people in the very first article, and the headline of that first article in the series was "Huge Rent Increases Have Charleston Area Residents Questioning if They Should Move." That has to, just make civic leaders and planners shake to think about that. That to have such a wonderful place that people can afford to live in.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen as much discussion among towns and cities about actually getting involved and doing something about affordable housing as we have lately. I mean, we've had Greenville, Charleston, Hilton Head, all creating affordable housing funds or initiatives, putting millions or tens of millions of dollars on the table. Rock Hill has a workforce housing initiative now. Charleston County is talking about spending 25 million or more, not all focused on rent, but all focused on affordable housing. So yeah, I would agree with you that civic leaders are a little nervous.
Well, and I mean, without getting a handle on this, how could it impact future growth and quality of life in this region and the state?
Well, I mean, I think probably the big impact is going to be that it's going to be increasingly hard for moderately paid workers to come here. I mean, whether it's teachers and firefighters or newspaper reporters and nursing assistants. When you're looking at paying $20,000 a year for an efficiency apartment, a $40,000 salary doesn't look real appealing, and it might be much more so in Atlanta or Greenville or somewhere else.
Charleston specifically, question someone had raised was, I'm summarizing this a bit, but as Mayor Tecklenburg and his administration, what have they done about the issue of affordable housing?
Well, I know a fair amount about that because I used to cover the city back in the 2000s, and I mean, Charleston has actually been doing, I would say certainly more than any city on the coast, probably more than any in the state, to try to do something about affordable housing. And I mean, going back to Mayor Riley and continuing through Mayor Tecklenburg, and some of it's been focused on home ownership. And the city has spent tens of millions of dollars over the years in that area. But the big thing they're doing right now, which some cities are starting to adopt, but many haven't, is they're increasingly requiring developers to include relatively affordable housing when they build a big development. And we're not talking about low income housing. We're talking about moderate income housing, that sort of missing middle that people keep talking about that we don't have here. So when a developer comes in and wants to redevelop Laurel Island over by the bridge, the city will say, okay, here's your enormous redevelopment plan. And, as part of it, 20% of the housing has to meet these affordable standards. And they say, okay. And that holds true with large apartment buildings as well. So it's an incremental step. It's maybe not a very visible one, but through zoning initiatives and development negotiations, they've been able to get a lot of more affordable housing, especially rentals, sort of built and in the pipeline.
Yeah, and one of the installments in the Priced Out series was about the apartment housing, I believe it was in Rock Hill, and how they agreed to, build a certain number or percentage of the units as being affordable, but then it turned out that affordability was based on the Charlotte market and not necessarily the Rock Hill market. So there raised questions about whether people who were living and working in Rock Hill could actually even afford what were supposed to be the affordable housing options that's just paints quite the picture of what we're looking at. Let's see if we can address a few more questions from some of our viewers here. And Teresa had submitted a question, was asking, and someone else in the Q&A has touched on a similar thing for discussion, but would lowering the property tax rate for rentals help enough to make rentals affordable?
Okay, I'll volunteer to take that one too. And I'm sorry, Briah, I'm stealing all the questions from you. So what the viewer is asking about is in South Carolina, the property tax treatment of rental property is very different than owner occupied homes. I mean, if you own a house and you live in it, your taxes are pretty low. You don't have to pay the school district operating tax. If you turn around and rent that same house, your property taxes roughly triple. So the question is, would lowering that tax rate or tax treatment of rental properties make rent more affordable? I guess in theory it could, if you assume that the landlords will pass the savings along to the renters. But on the other hand, landlords aren't raising rent by 30% because their expenses have gone up by 30%. They're raising rent 30% because they can. So, I mean, there's an open debate about whether reducing their direct expenses will prompt them to turn around and reduce the rent they charge. But yes, renters indirectly pay 3 times the property tax that homeowners pay.
Yeah, and I mean, that's significant, but you're right. How could it be legislated that they would have to pass those savings on if they receive them? I just, it complicates matters, but just to know that triple rate, helps explain some of this that's going on. But then you should watch as others with similar units and things that have available raise their rents, and they're like, oh, they're staying, but they're still filling them. Let's raise ours, and creates a cyclical problem. It seems that does need to be addressed. One person had noted, but what the Charleston County School District is doing in terms of exploring the idea of building affordable housing for its teachers and employees, it brings up that idea, the old formula of a company town, mills and mining companies and things. Is that are we looking at a future that kind of repeats this history? David, this probably fall to you as well. So
sorry, Briah. The sort of mill village comparison's a little bit hard to ignore. But yeah, what we're talking about, what we're really seeing is that in increasing numbers of places, school districts are getting involved with creating housing for teachers. And the main two reasons it's school districts that are doing this is because they have, moderately paid employees that they're all fighting to compete for, but they also have land. And so they're largely entering into deals where they'll take land they already own that maybe they don't need or maybe they're not using, and they'll have a developer come in and build housing on it. And because the school district owns the land, that takes the cost of land out of the cost of the development, and they're able to keep rents low. It's an interesting model. It's been done in multiple school districts in North Carolina. We've also seen that happen in Baltimore, Miami, San Francisco, and now the Charleston School District's looking at it. And I think, and yeah, you always hear people go, oh no, like the mill village thing, because yeah, back in the day, all the textile mills and coal mining operations in the Northeast would build, shabby little villages for their workers to live in, and they were notoriously not very nice. And if the workers ever got a raise, surprise, their rent went up too. And it was a really abusive system. And I don't think it's real fair to compare that to this. I guess the one similarity would be if you're a teacher in affordable housing your district has provided, if you leave that job, you're probably gonna also lose your affordable housing. So that would be the one similarity.
And again, in the Q&A and in some of the prior provided questions, people do raise the question about rent control and whether that's even a thing or a possibility in South Carolina. I mean, I can't say that. I mean, I'm only aware of it in much larger cities, and I don't know if it's ever been broached here, but it seems that there's something coming to a head here where local or state governments, county governments are going to have to step into the breach.
Yeah, rent control is illegal in South Carolina, state law.
So then via local county, state officials. Do you think that's where the answer is going to have to lie? And helping find some sort of solution to this?
Well, I mean, local governments, I mean, they can't consider rent control or anything like it because that's prohibited by state law. But local governments, you know, or the state could get involved in working on solutions to create more affordable housing. And that usually comes down to either money or zoning incentives or some combination. And then there's also private industry, like in Hilton Head, where we saw the one resort there basically build apartments for its workers so that they would have workers.
Yeah. And, you know, the price out series is something that's ongoing. You know, many of these, you know, what we've written so far is obviously there's plenty to be said about those topics, but there's plenty more to explore, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not just here, but I mean, Briah, I know you've looked at some of the numbers. I mean, this area really is seeing outsized rent increases. I mean, we're not seeing the same thing everybody's seeing, right?
Definitely. It's across the state and going into North Carolina as well. I know we talked a little bit about Rock Hill, but over the past 2 years, they've seen rent increase by 41%. Myrtle Beach is up 30%. Up in North Carolina and Raleigh, it's up to 28%. So it's happening all across the state and even up into North Carolina. So it's definitely not just a Charleston issue.
Oh, right. I would take 28% over 47, but they both sound awful.
That's true. Well, thank you both for, you know, joining us for this discussion today, but also just more importantly for the work and the work that will continue in this priced out series and just examining, you know, the cost and the impact of growth and development, you know, both in the Charleston area, but, you know, across South Carolina, and how that compares to areas in the state, but also outside the state and, you know, and national. So maybe there are some ways that we could explore even some solutions, you know, at some point, but it's something that's definitely impacting a lot of people, and as seen by the number of people attending this today. But I also want to thank the viewers for watching, and remember that you can sign up for any of our free newsletters at postandcourier.com/newsletters-sign up. And if you're a subscriber, we say thank you. And if you're not, we encourage you to sign up at postandcourier.com/subscribe. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Good day.